Thank you very much, Kristen, and thanks to all of you. It is a joy to be here and to be back. Actually, I was just telling Kristen, I was last speaking at this conference in 2004, and there were only a few hundred people. So it is a testimony to the growth in the pro-life movement. It's testimony to Students for Life of America under Kristen's leadership as to how well this organization and your attendance has grown throughout the years. I want to begin by having you imagine something for a moment. I want you to imagine someone in a very cramped space, surrounded by darkness. It's very hot and humid, totally dependent on another individual or others for their survival. Someone who requires a long cord to give them the sustenance for life. Now, as you imagine that, who do you think I'm talking about? The baby. Well, I'm not. I'm actually talking about these 33 men. Who are they? The Chilean miners, that's correct. On August 5th, 2010, a year and a half ago, they were working in their mine when 700,000 tons of rock collapsed on it, trapping them below the surface of the earth for 69 days. And in that moment, the experience of these men became like the experience of preborn children, entirely dependent on someone else for their survival. In a situation much like birth, they even had to navigate a very narrow passageway to get to the surface. And unlike birth, where parents are waiting for the arrival of their children, children were awaiting the arrival of their parents, shedding tears of joy. It is unimaginable for us to think of the world abandoning these miners in their time of need. And the world didn't abandon these miners. In fact, it ran to their rescue. Their company, their country, and the world worked together to protect and respect the lives of these miners. Did we hear anyone say, well, you know, there's too many people in the world, it's overpopulated, let them die? Of course not. Did we hear anyone say, well, you know, it's going to cost a lot of money to rescue these guys, let them die? Did we hear anyone say it's going to be difficult to rescue them, easier to blow it up, let them die? We heard none of that. And yet, when it comes to the situation of preborn children, we routinely hear people say, let abortion happen. Maybe they aren't as explicit as saying let them die, but they're saying let abortion happen. And we have to ask ourselves, why the double standard? Why will our world protect and respect the lives of the miners, but not only not protect and respect the lives of the preborn, but actively and intentionally dismember, decapitate, and disembowel them? Well, in my experience of debating abortion advocates, the reason for the double standard is our society does not acknowledge the preborn to be human persons the way we acknowledge the minors to be human persons. That is why our world generally will not protect the preborn, but will protect the minors. And so the challenge for pro-lifers, the challenge in making a world without abortion, is to be able to articulate logically and reasonably how the preborn are human, how abortion kills them, and get people realizing just as we protect the minors, we need to protect the preborn. So in my time that I have with you this morning, I'm going to equip you to be able to logically make the case for the preborn being human beings from fertilization onwards. Before I go into that, however, I want to talk first about how we get that message across. There's an organization here in America called Stand to Reason, and one of the things they talk about is that when you represent a viewpoint, you become an ambassador to that view, the way someone becomes an ambassador to a country. And if you are an ambassador to a viewpoint or to a country, you want to be a good ambassador. And Stand to Reason highlights 3 qualities of a good ambassador, and it's those qualities that I would say we all need to have when we become ambassadors to the pro-life perspective. And it's those qualities I'm going to define, and hopefully you will see as a running theme throughout the rest of my presentation, because I want you to leave here making sure that you are good ambassadors for the pro-life perspective. There are 3 qualities of a good ambassador. A good ambassador has knowledge, wisdom, and character. So knowledge involves things like giving evidence, having good science, making a philosophical case. But it's not enough to simply know that. You need to communicate it with wisdom. Wisdom tells us how to communicate the knowledge we have. And so as I communicate my knowledge with you this morning, I'm going to be talking about, with wisdom, how we need to find common ground. Where do we have common ground, and how can we articulate to the person we're speaking to that we have that? Making analogies that they can understand or relate to. Asking good questions and illustrating our point. Then there is character. Knowledge, wisdom, and character. We have to make sure that everything we say and how we say it is complimented and commended by who we are. If we talk about respect, we need to be respectful. If we talk about love, we need to show love. And so when it comes to character, I'm reminded of the quote by the great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said, "Whom you would change, you must first love. And they must know that you love them." Whom you would change, you must first love. And they must know that you love them. So let's move forward now into making that pro-life case, and I'd like you to be thinking about knowledge, wisdom, and character. Where am I appealing to science? Where am I using philosophy? Am I asking questions? Look for how all of that will be weaved through the pro-life case against abortion. When it comes to making the case that the preborn are human, again, because of the power of illustrations, I always illustrate my point. I often grab a scrap piece of paper and I draw an arrow for the person I'm talking to, and I say, let's imagine we're dealing with someone who's 20. And we want to determine when in the timeline of this 20-year-old's life she first came into existence. Well, we know 20 years prior, the process called birth occurred. And we know that 9 months prior to birth, a process called fertilization occurred. Oh, all my things are showing up at the same time. And at fertilization, we know several things. The first is that all the genetic information which distinguishes this 20-year-old from the rest of us, her hair color, her eye color, all of that is determined at fertilization. We also know at fertilization that the preborn are human. And we know they're human because they have human parents. And science teaches us that living things reproduce after their own kind. Dogs produce dogs, and cats produce, and humans produce humans. So we know at fertilization, and I actually should point out here, this is a difference between Canadian and Americans. I'm saying fertilization. Apparently you guys say fertilization. That's how in general you can have a fertile myrtle. It just doesn't work in Canada. It would be like a fertile myrtile, you know. One American did say to me, it sounds so much more refined though, like fertile, as though you're talking in a British accent. You know, once I wanted to give a whole pro-life presentation in a British accent, but at this point you won't take me seriously, and so I will return to speaking in Canadian with fertilization. So, we know that they're human because they have human parents. We also know they're alive, and we know they're alive because science also teaches us that living things come from other living things. Now, having said that, if the abortion advocate is thinking, they will then say, well, if living things come from other living things, then the sperm and the egg from which the zygote came must also be alive, and if they are sperm and egg from humans, then they're humans, so they're living humans. So are you saying sperm and egg are equal to zygotes? So this fourth point is very important, and that is, at fertilization, the preborn are whole living humans, as opposed to a part of a living human. So the sperm and the egg are human parts, much like my hand or my foot, but the zygote is a whole human being. And the best scientific case I've ever read for how the preborn are human at fertilization and how they are different from the sperm and the egg is a case made by Dr. Maureen Kondik in her paper, When Does Human Life Begin? And in this paper, she talks about how life not only begins at fertilization, but it begins at the beginning of fertilization, because fertilization is a process that takes about 24 hours. So now some people are saying, well, at what point in 24 hours does it come into existence? So Dr. Kondik makes a phenomenal case for it being the beginning of the 24 hours, which literally is an instant called sperm-egg fusion. And the way Dr. Kondik makes this case is to talk about how scientists distinguish one cell type from another. She says when scientists want to distinguish one cell from another, they look at two criteria. What is the composition of the cell, and what is its behavior? And she says, by looking at these two criteria, this is how we can determine that the zygote is fundamentally different from the sperm cell or the egg cell. So the composition, for example, of the sperm is the genetic material of the father. The composition of the egg is the genetic material of the mother. But the moment one sperm penetrates the egg, that zygote contains all the genetic material of the mother and the father, even prior to the chromosomes intermingling. Nonetheless, all that genetic material is there. Now let's look at behavior. The behavior of a sperm, find an egg and penetrate it. The behavior of an egg, allow for penetration. But the moment one sperm penetrates the egg, that zygote acts to prevent penetration. Its behavior, that one-celled zygote, its behavior is fundamentally different from the sperm and the egg. So we know at fertilization we are dealing with a genetically distinct, living, whole human being. I think one of the best analogies for making that case, an illustration to make that point even further, is with regards to a Polaroid camera. Richard Stiff came up with this analogy, although I've put my own little twist on it. And I actually once had a picture up like this for a group of 7th grade students, and I asked them what it was, and they guessed a printer. And so there is a whole generation of young people that does not know what a Polaroid camera is. So, assumingly we all know, you take the photo, the little white card comes out, you wave it, and you wait for your image to appear. I want you to imagine that you are on a holiday in the wonderful country of Scotland, and you go to Scotland because my dad's from there, and you think it's a really cool place with a fantastic accent. So you go to Scotland to a very famous place called Loch Ness. What's in Loch Ness? Of course. You know, my grandma swears she saw the Loch Ness Monster. So you're on Loch Ness on a boat, enjoying your vacation. You turn to your right. 2 arms lengths away from you, you see none other than the Loch Ness Monster. I mean, all those humps and bumps are sticking out of the water. So you grab the only camera you have, which happens to be a Polaroid camera, and you snap a photo of Nessie. And just as the little white card is coming out, the monster goes underwater. You're not worried, because you now have visual proof to show the world that what some people thought was a myth actually is reality. Now, you're in a boat with a friend of yours, and your friend has never seen a Polaroid camera before. And so she excitedly grabs the card from you to take a look at the picture, but she doesn't see the picture yet. She only sees brown smudges. Not knowing how the camera works, she thinks the photo didn't take. And with great disappointment, she tosses it into the lake. Now, would you be mad? I know I would be. Now, imagine if in getting mad at your friend, thinking about all the money you'll no longer make from selling this photo to newspapers and magazines, and getting mad at your friend, she responds, "But it's just brown smudges. What do you care about brown smudges for?" And you'd likely reply, "It wasn't just brown smudges. Everything about the image of the Loch Ness Monster was captured in an instant. It just needed time to develop." And so the same can be said about who each one of us is today. Who we are is literally captured in that instant of sperm-egg fusion. We just need time to develop. Now, in our development, there naturally are some differences if we are to compare one human who's developing to another human who is developing. And what I find in the abortion debate is people are divorcing human from person. And if they're intellectually honest to some degree, they will say, okay, I'm not going to argue with your science and your cute little analogy about Polaroid cameras. Fine, it's a human being. But, they'll say, it's not a person. A human is what you are biologically, but a person, the abortion advocate will claim, is much, much more. And they will say because the human fetus does not act in certain ways or appear in certain ways, it's not classified as a person. Now, there are differences between the preborn child and all of us, but we have to ask ourselves whether our personhood should be defined based on these differences. Now, they're all going to appear here, but the differences are size. Yes, the preborn are smaller. Their development, they are significantly less developed than us physically, intellectually. Maybe they can't feel pain early in pregnancy, can't think and reason, be aware of themselves. There's the difference of environment. Obviously, they're in their mother's bodies and very dependent on her body. But the moment an abortion advocate uses any or all of this criteria to deny the preborn personhood status, ask that advocate to look at the little paper you would have drawn, all of this laid out, and say, look at the time from birth to someone who's an adult, and ask yourself, are there differences? And again, they'll have to admit there are differences. So then we ask, should our personhood or our right to life be based on those differences? And they're not going to deny an infant, a 2-year-old, or even a 16-year-old that individual's right to life simply because he or she is smaller or less developed than a 50-year-old. Well, if they're not going to deny personhood there, personhood before birth. I'm going to illustrate this further, again, using just different examples, with some images from a parenting book, an actual parenting book my colleague found, called The Do's and Don'ts of Parenting. And as you can see, there are just some exercises that we cannot do with a born child because of that child's size and lack of development. And yet we don't deny personhood status to that child. Well, neither should we deny personhood status to a preborn child because they're smaller. There are some games you just can't play with an infant, and it doesn't mean that the child is not a person simply because they're less developed intellectually. Well, the same is true for the preborn, regardless of their lower level of development. And we just won't survive in certain environments. It doesn't mean we're not people when we're in those environments or other ones. Well, the same is true for the preborn. And yes, there are born children that are dependent on other people's body for their survival, but not all people's bodies for their survival. And it doesn't mean that that born child isn't a person. Well, correspondingly, a 7.5-week embryo is very dependent on the environment of his mother's body. It doesn't mean that he's not a person. So what is a person? I decided to do my own little unscientific poll, inquiring of various people I meet how they would define a person. And I decided to admittedly start quite young with my niece, actually, who I just have to give a little shout out to. She's 5 today. And I like to claim that my niece brought life to a day of death. And when my sister went into labor 5 years ago, I was actually speaking in Alaska, and I got word that she was in labor. I thought, okay, just as long as you have the baby on this day and don't just go into labor on this day. So I was really happy that my niece was one of many who have redeemed this day. But I asked my niece, she's 5 now, but I asked her just before she turned 3. I put on a video camera, this is unscripted, and I said, Monica, how do you define a person? And so we're going to play this video, and you will hear what she says. Hey Monica, what's a person?
No matter a person in the picture, no matter how small.
That's brilliant. Who taught you that?
Mommy told the person here the crew.
That's right. Are you a person?
No.
You're not?
I'm a girl.
Are girls not people? Are boys people?
No.
Well, then who's a person?
You.
Oh, thank you. I don't know where she got that from. And of course, using her logic, if girls aren't people, but I am a person, then I can't logically be a girl. So she kind of had it right at the beginning. I was quite hopeful, and then it kind of took a downward spiral. But she's still developing, and so when she gets a certain level of development, she will answer that question differently. So I upped the age of people that I asked that question to, and I decided to ask a group of 7th grade students how they would define a person. I told them, I want you to imagine that I'm an alien from another planet who's come to Earth for the first time. And as I encounter you Earthlings, I hear you talking about people, and I don't know what a person is. So if you had to define a person for me, how would you do it? And this one little boy shoots his arm up right away with a lot of enthusiasm, so I point to him directly. I said, yes, how would you define a person? He says, a person is someone with 2 arms and 2 legs. Really, I said. Well, that's interesting. Because this guy, Nick Vujicic, a speaker from Australia, doesn't have arms and legs. Is he a person? I asked these students. They all nodded. Yes, he's a person. And I said, well, then that can't be our definition of a person. What's a person? So another student raised their hand and said, well, a person is someone with feelings, someone who can feel things. Really, I said, that's interesting, because this little girl, Gabby Gingras, was born with a very rare condition where she cannot feel pain. In fact, she's wearing those swimming goggles because as a baby she poked at her eyes and poked and never felt pain to tell her to stop. An infection resulted and one of her eyes had to be removed. These goggles are her parents' attempt to preserve the one eye she has left. Is Gabby a person, I asked these students, even though she can't feel pain? And they all agreed, yes, she is. Well, then I said, that can't be our definition of a person. What's a person? So this girl near the front raised her hand and she says, well, a person is someone who can think and talk. Well, I said, my nephew Francis, when he was born, couldn't think or talk. Still working on both of those things. Was he a person, and is he a person? And they all agreed, yes, he is. Well, then that can't be the definition of a person. What is a person? And there was this girl near the back of the room, kind of frantically waving her arm, trying to get my attention. And I thought finally, okay, I should oblige and let the poor girl speak. So I said, yes, how would you define a person? And with a lot of exasperation, she says, look, it is really easy to figure out if someone is of the species Homo sapiens, and if they are, then they're a person. I subsequently asked her if I could take her to universities with me. And indeed, what this girl recognized is that the only tie that binds, the only thing we all have in common is our human nature, our membership in the human family. That can be determined objectively, scientifically, whether someone is human or not, we can determine that. But us differs in every other way. Appearance, abilities, and so on, as we've seen. If we define person based on some ability, not only is it arbitrary, but we are excluding a whole bunch of human beings who are already born, people like Nick and Gabby and my nephew. But if we define person, simply acknowledge it as being a member of the human family, then everyone's safe. In fact, if you look at the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, they call it human rights, not person rights. And that declaration came in the late 1940s on the heels of the Holocaust, where humans were denied personhood status. And there was this recognition that person is a tool, is a word, a legal term that societies use to define certain humans out of existence when those humans have something they want or get in their way. And we have seen that term be used not only against Jews during the Holocaust, but against blacks during the time of slavery, even against women where we were once denied personhood based on our gender. I would say the term person tells us less about what someone is and more about what kind of society we are. Are we inclusive or exclusive? Are we selfless or selfish? Are we tolerant of the weak and vulnerable, or are we intolerant of the weak and vulnerable? If you think about all the differences between the preborn and the born, their size, the level of development, environment, and dependency, all of those ultimately boil down to one thing, and I don't mean the acronym SLED that they formed. All of those differences boil down to age. The preborn are smaller because of how old they are. They're less developed because of how old they are. They're in their mother's bodies because in our species, when you're that age, you need your mother's body to survive. They're dependent on their mother's bodies because of how old they are. Ultimately, abortion boils down to age discrimination. And if those of us who are whiter don't have a right to kill those who are darker, neither should those of us who are older have a right to kill those who are younger. as much as it is reasonable to frame abortion in terms of age discrimination, many who support abortion aren't thinking of it from that perspective. And I actually know that because the more I've talked to people and framed it that way, the abortion advocates becomes very uncomfortable because they hate to be labeled as discriminating against someone based on a feature like that. But they're not thinking about it in those terms, but instead they are thinking about the abortion debate in terms of the circumstances that a pregnant woman finds herself in. They're generally not coming from the perspective of acknowledging the preborn to be human and saying, I want to kill them, but instead they're coming from the perspective of acknowledging the woman to be human, her situation to be a crisis, and out of the goodness of their heart, they desire to alleviate that crisis. They're misguided as to how they're fixing the problem, but there is a sense of goodness there that they want to fix someone's crisis. Let's look at all the circumstances of an unplanned pregnancy. These are typically the circumstances an abortion advocate will give for why at least some abortions are justified. And in each one of these circumstances, we have to ask ourselves, would we ever allow someone to kill a born child to deal with these problems? And if we wouldn't allow someone to kill a born child, neither should we allow them to kill the preborn child. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't convey empathy. When someone who supports abortion says, what about rape or what about poverty, I would say the first thing we need to do is one of the approaches of wisdom, which is to find common ground. And the way you can find common ground is to acknowledge that indeed that is a horrible situation. That a woman who is pregnant as a result of rape is facing a horribly unjust situation, and she needs our help and support. Someone who cannot afford the basic needs that their child has to meet those needs, that is a crisis that we have concern about. Acknowledge that, find common ground. Then make an analogy to a born child and say, as much as that is a difficult situation, would we ever use that crisis as grounds to kill a born child? The moment they say no, but that's different, that the fetus isn't the same as an infant, then we're back to the question I already answered, which is, are the preborn human? Are they persons? And then you use the science, you use the philosophy with all those illustrations to make the case for their humanity. I'll give you one more in-depth example, however, for how I handle this in the case of rape. Certainly, we need to convey great compassion for people who have been sexually assaulted. And it's important to bear in mind that if someone asks you, what about rape? Tread the waters carefully when you answer that question, because you may be looking into the eyes of someone who has been raped. Because I cannot tell you the number of times I have spoken to students on college campuses and they have confided in me something they have not told anyone who knows them, which is that they have been sexually assaulted. So you start with that common ground. You start with expressing sorrow for that situation. And one of the points I often make is that amongst friends of mine who have been sexually assaulted, it's become very clear to me that it takes much longer than 9 months to work through that trauma. And that independent of getting pregnant, every day that rape victim is going to have triggers which remind her of the trauma. Be it pregnancy or be it something else, lots of things are going to trigger that trauma. The question is, though, is it ethical or reasonable to inflict a trauma on someone else, as well as, you could argue, on that woman again, a different kind of trauma, just because an injustice has happened once? So the analogy I'll use is to say, imagine a woman has had sex with her husband on Monday, and on Tuesday, when she's walking home from work, she gets raped. A month later, she discovers she's pregnant, and she doesn't know whether the father of her child is her husband or the rapist. So let's say she hopes it's her husband's child, carries on with the pregnancy, and after the baby is born, a paternity test is done. Results come back and reveal the father of the child is not her husband. It's the rapist. Now that you've shared that analogy, you ask the abortion supporter, would we allow that woman or anyone to kill the newborn child because of the father's crime? And the abortion advocate will say what? No, but that's different. A fetus isn't like an infant. Then we say the real question is not how was someone conceived, but what was conceived. Are we dealing with a human being, or are we not. All of that answers the question, what are the preborn? When does life begin? Are the preborn humans? Are they persons? But all of which I've shared with you doesn't answer the question, what is abortion? What is that procedure which occurs over 1 million times annually in America and over 42 million times annually throughout the world? What is that procedure? And I would say if we want to envision a world without abortion, we need to introduce the world to abortion. Because currently our world perceives abortion as choice. And choice is good. And people won't catch our vision for no abortion as long as it's perceived as a positive thing. So we need to redefine the choice of abortion for people, shifting the debate in the abstract from the abstract notion of choice to the concrete reality of what is being chosen. And when we do that and people see abortion for the ugliness that it is, then there will be a growing movement of people who not only desire to envision a world without abortion, but will make a world without abortion. In a few moments, I'm going to play for you a video that I hope you will use as a tool to convince your peers on campuses and elsewhere as to why abortion is a grave moral wrong, not a woman's right. But before I play this video, I'd like to make a few points. Also letting the PowerPoint guys know I'll still need my PowerPoint for a little bit. I have a friend who was giving a talk once and he said, you know, I remember growing up, my mom always said to me, eat your vegetables, Brett, there's starving kids in Africa. How many of you were told that? I was told that all the time because I didn't eat my vegetables. And I've been doing pro-life work for 10 years, staying in people's homes, and I learned to eat my vegetables. But my friend Brett said, you know, my mom would say that to me, and that never meant much to me. He said, that never meant much to me until I went to Africa. And he said, then I saw starvation, and I held starvation. And he said, suddenly everything my mother had said to me for all those years took on a whole new meaning in my life. We can talk to people about abortion and the preborn and why abortion's wrong until we're blue in the face. But I firmly believe we need to see abortion and show abortion for people to truly, deeply grasp how grave this issue is. And we know that from looking at other social movements. For example, the abolitionist movement in Great Britain, in a time before photography knew about the power of images. Even in the movie Amazing Grace, the actor here playing Thomas Clarkson, the movie featured how this abolitionist, Thomas Clarkson, would travel across England, and every time he gave presentations, he would do demonstrations with chains and shackles as to how the slaves were being inhumanely treated. The abolitionists even had a sketching done of the inside of a slave ship, showing with measurement of feet and inches exactly how the humans were packed in like cargo. You have the anti-child labor movement here in America, where in the early 1900s, Lewis Hine, a photographer, traveled across your country, particularly to places like the mines of Pennsylvania, and take images like this, of children working long hours, in dangerous conditions, being robbed of their childhood. It's actually important to point out that by 1920, the number of child laborers in America was cut in half from what it had been in 1910. And that was only 12 years after Hine began his campaign of taking and distributing these photographs. Of course, the civil rights movement, we're very familiar with the power of the images for that movement. The story of Emmett Till, a young boy who was brutally murdered and whose mother had an open casket funeral so people could see how racism looked on the face of a child violently beaten to death simply for having a different color skin. Dr. Martin Luther King always wanted media with him when they did marches and when they did protests. And he wanted media with him because he knew the power of the image. And he wanted them to capture the image of the brutal treatment that was being inflicted upon African Americans. The power of the fire hoses was so strong, it ripped bark off of trees. Now imagine what it's doing to the body of that civil rights activist. King knew for racism to end and segregation to end, the reality of it needed to be seen. Then there's the state of Montana, which has an anti-crystal meth campaign, which has been so successful that several other states have taken it on. And this campaign involves very disturbing imagery, as well as commercials, about the impact of becoming addicted to crystal meth. In 2005, the state of Montana ranked 5th in America for crystal meth use. 5th. Since this campaign, it now ranks 39th. And crystal meth use by teenagers has declined by 63%. So on that note, as the video gets prepared, I'm going to play for you a film that you can get on our website, unmaskingchoice.ca, called Abortion, Before and After. You are going to see beautiful imagery of the preborn child, and it's so important that we convey that. And then it will be contrasted to the destructive element of abortion. Certainly, it's important that we convey mercy to anyone who has been involved with abortion and already made this choice. And I think a powerful reference to anyone who is experiencing the pain of having been involved with abortion is to remember the song Amazing Grace, written by John Newton, who was a former slave ship owner and who basically destroyed over 20,000 lives as a result of enslaving people. And someone once asked him, how can someone who helped sell 22,000 of his fellow human beings into slavery call himself a pastor? And Newton replied, I know only 2 things. I'm a great sinner, and Christ is a great Savior. We will not run to the foot of the cross and call out for a Savior if we don't acknowledge that we are sinners. And so it's important to remember Newton's words. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see. A summer ago, I was standing on the street with our team back in Canada, witnessing in still form what you just saw in video form. And with us was a friend of mine, Anita, who is silent no more. And as we were standing in the street, my job that day was to not have any signs, but to observe passersby, and then approach people and say, "What do you think about abortion?" And I noticed a young woman had just stepped off the crosswalk onto the sidewalk, and this image is exactly what was confronting her. And she was just staring at it, and so I approached and very gently said, "What do you think about abortion?" And she began to respond with describing what she was seeing. "Well, oh my gosh," she said, "it is ribs, fingers." And I very gently said, "Yes, and that's just in the first trimester, when a majority of abortions happen." And I noticed as I was talking that tears were filling in her eyes. And something told me that she had likely had an abortion. And to try to draw that out in order to be able to minister to her, I said, "Do you know anyone who's had an abortion?" And then she nodded. And I said, "I know people too." And at that, she said, "I have to go." She turned to walk away. And I went up to my friend Anita and I said, "Anita, quick, can I please have one of your business cards with the phone number women can call?" By the time she got it, this woman was a block away, and I literally was running down the street towards her, and I said, excuse me. And she stopped and turned around. And I said, "I just want to give you this card for your friends. You know, if any of them feel that they need to talk to someone or they regret their abortion and need help, they can call this number and someone will be there for them." And she took it, and at this point the tears were just streaming down her face. And so I very gently said, "Did you have one?" And she said yes. And I said, "May I hug you?" And she said yes. And I said, "I am sorry for your loss." And then she said to me something I hope no other woman can ever say. She said, "Nobody told me it looked like that." And that woman made the choice she did out of ignorance, because nobody told her. If we withhold what we know, then her sin of commission becomes our sin of omission. The good news is that when we expose choice for what it really is, not only can we move women to places of healing and help, but we can spare women from even experiencing abortion to begin with. This is my colleague Francisco, who got married almost 4 weeks ago. And in his arms is a baby that he helped save from abortion. And not many people can say that a baby saved from abortion went to their wedding. But Francisco can say that. Because when he was protesting on the streets with our signs in the rain, unbeknownst to him and the rest of our team, a pregnant woman walked past who was scheduled for an abortion. And the next day, when she left work, she saw them again. She canceled her appointment, and it was only by chance, or you could say divine intervention, that several months later, when she was visibly pregnant, she was at a party that my colleague Francisco happened to be at. And they just got talking, and she said, "What do you do?" So Francisco began to describe his work. And then she told her story. When she was in labor, she called Francisco and his now wife, my colleague Alana, to come to the hospital. And there Francisco and Alana waited until Adrian was born. So we can not only move women into healing who have had abortions, but we can spare women and children from abortion. As I get close to wrapping things up, I would like to make a few comments regarding that third aspect of being a good ambassador. You may recall the three qualities are knowledge, wisdom, and character. And it's very important that we remember our culture is a wounded culture. And one of the challenges we have in trying to make a world, envision and make a world without abortion, is that so many people within this world have been intimately involved with abortion decisions, have also very much faced a lot of pain and woundedness. A few months ago, I was at an exhibit very similar to the Genocide Awareness Project that my organization does. This exhibit was called Justice for All. And while I was at this exhibit debating with students about abortion over a 2-day period, I met a woman who had been raped a year ago, a woman who had been badly hurt in the foster care system, who the night before speaking to me found out that her cousin committed suicide. I met a man who was a recovering heroin and cocaine addict, and another man whose parents were drug abusers and whose father brutally beat him and abused him for 6 years. All of these people that I met in 2 days, I would estimate, were in their early 20s. And so it's very important as we engage the culture about abortion that we not be like a torpedo ramming through a conversation. That we take time to get to know the person in front of us who, for whatever reason, God has meant for our paths to intersect. And it's important to remember to balance the head and the heart. And I've given you a lot of head knowledge, but the danger is that you only take the head. And it's very important that you remember every encounter needs the head and the heart. And there's this tendency within the pro-life movement to compartmentalize approaches. Well, the pregnancy centers are heart. And the educational places, that's about head. No, the pregnancy center needs head and heart. The educational approach needs head and heart. Both approaches involve meeting people face to face. And as a result of that, we need to make sure that we have a beautiful balance between communicating truth in love. And so sometimes people say to me, well, you've given me so much information, I don't know how I'm going to remember it all. So besides encouraging them to go to our website once again on maskingchoice.ca, I'll say to people, you know what, if you forget everything I've said, remember this. Getting ready to write it down? Listen. Listen to the person in front of you. That's what you need to remember. If you truly and compassionately look into their eyes and listen to what they are saying and the tone in which they are saying it, and pray for divine inspiration for how to respond, then you will ask the right questions. And you will think of good analogies. And you will know when to speak and when to pause, because you are listening to the wounded individual in front of you. When I was talking to this student who was a recovering heroin and cocaine addict, we talked for about 20 minutes about abortion, and he admitted to facilitating the abortion of his own child back when he was addicted to heroin and cocaine, arguing then and when he and I were speaking that it was the right thing to do. And after we spoke about logic for about 20 minutes and he seemed firm in his position, I thought, I don't feel like I'm going anywhere with this guy. So since he's seen the pictures and he's heard the arguments, we'll just talk about something else for a bit. So I began to talk to him, and I said, you know, you said you've been clean for a year. That's pretty good. And I was all proud all of a sudden. He goes, yeah, I know. And so we got talking about that, about his addiction, and I got thinking, you know, I don't want him to leave here if he comes to a conviction later that his abortion was wrong, the one he was involved with, that he's to be condemned. But how do I convey this to a guy who doesn't admit it was wrong and who has just told me as a result of our conversation that he's an atheist? So I asked a question. I said, can I ask you something? It seems off topic, but I have a purpose for it. And he said, sure. I said, well, have you ever done something in your life that, you know, you really regret, you think is really dumb? And at first he's like, no. And I was kind of shocked. I said, really? Because I make mistakes all the time. Like every day I think, oh, that was so stupid, Stephanie. Or I can't believe you did that. I said, really? And I was kind of so dumbfounded. He's like, okay, well, actually, yeah, you know what? He said, you know how I told you I'd been clean for like 6 years? It was actually a year ago. I was at this house party and I was offered some free heroin, and so I did it again. And I said, how did you feel after it? He goes, I thought that was really stupid. The next morning I was like, I'll never do that again. And I said, okay, so you admit that was a mistake, you shouldn't have done it. And he said, yes. And I said, and did you think, well, I'll keep doing it because I failed, so I may as well keep failing? He goes, no, not at all. He goes, I'm like, that was the stupidest decision I ever made. I'm not going to do it again. I was clean this long. I have to still be clean. And then I said, okay, well, I just want you to remember that. I said, I know you said you don't think the abortion was wrong. I just want you to know, though, if at any point in the future you change your mind and you think that it was wrong, that you have the same attitude about that you have about the heroin you took a year ago. That you can't change the past, but you can change the future by doing in the present moment something you'd wished you'd done in the past. And at the end of our conversation, I said, I just want to say again, I think it's really great that you've been clean for a year. And it's my hope that one day that young man, who I'll likely never see again, will come to recognize the dignity of the preborn because someone recognized the dignity in him. As I bring things to a close, I'd like to end where I began, talking about the Chilean miners. When one of those miners was rescued, he said, "Thank you for believing that we were alive. Thank you for believing that we were alive." If today, at this conference, you envision a world without abortion, and then tomorrow and each day forward, you strive to make a world without abortion, and you apply all the principles that I've crammed into 1 hour with you, information about how to defend the pro-life view and how to love the person in front of you, then at some point, I am hopeful, in your lifetime, you will come face to face with people who were spared abortion as a result of your efforts, and looking into your eyes, they will say, "Thank you for believing that we were alive." God bless you.